deeper inside. You move through my veins, you move through every part of me. Take you to places no one knows to find relief. Cut through my side. Oh, more time enough to fight. Drain out of every part of me. When I think if you would change your mind and leave. Oh,
Hi, John. Hi, John.
How's it going?
It's going. How are you doing, sir?
Not too bad.
Awesome. Well, we are live. Or something like that. I hope we're live. If not, what are we doing this for?
Well, I mean, I guess we're just doing it for ourselves then.
How selfish. Selfish. Anyways, if you are just now getting on with us and watching our little show, we would like to welcome you. And this is kind of a big one for both of us. We are now diving into a very long discussion, I think you could begin to call it that. The Overland Campaign of 1864. It's one of the bloodiest things to happen on this continent. And I think, I don't want to say it goes unwatched or like unheard of or unwritten about, because there's a lot of material written on the Overland Campaign. But I do think a lot of larger battles capture the attention over these, specifically like Wilderness and Spotsylvania, even though they're, for us, like people who have studied these places and been to these places and given tours of these places know the the severity of the fighting there and the consequences that these battles will have in play with decisions later on and command casualties, yada yada yada. But it doesn't get the attention Gettysburg or Antietam or Fredericksburg. Even Fredericksburg gets, I think, more attention than like Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, the latter half of the Overland Campaign, North Anna even. But
Well,
go
I
ahead,
mean,
please.
I think a lot of that, the Overland Campaign is weird. It's confusing. There basically are no battles during the entire campaign that have a clean, obvious, decisive result. Which is something that I think a lot of people, when they study the Civil War, they kind of get used to this idea that most of the big battles are pretty decisively either a victory or a defeat for someone. But that's not really how that's not how the Overland Campaign really worked, and it's kind of not really how the war worked starting 1864 moving on.
And I mean, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Like, that's what I think I was trying to. You also kind of tie in with the whole like not having any really big significance as such as Gettysburg in the vast, I think, public eye. They're just not really tying it together. They hear Gettysburg and they automatically think, oh man, Gettysburg has such, that's it, that's the end of the war. No, there's so many things that take place afterwards. I mean, you go into, like I said, Wilderness, which is our topic tonight, which is going to be great. We're actually on the 157th anniversary of the Battle of the Wilderness, the second day, which would be May 6th, 1864. We are on May 6th, 2021. 157 years to the day, and a sight to behold if you were standing anywhere near the Wilderness battlefield on that day in 64. Probably would have had an orange hue to the sky that was it was now darkening at night. It was 9 or 9 p.m. So yeah, it would have been dark. Then that's all attributed just to the intensity of the fighting and what happened. So obviously we're going to learn about why there's an orange hue to the wilderness. Why is it called the wilderness? Maybe we should start there, or should we start with a little bit of a backstory on 1864 and why we're in this area to begin with? John,
Let's maybe explain what the wilderness is first.
I think that's a good idea. Yeah. Do you want would you like me to take, or is that you?
I can do it. So
Please
what
do.
is the wilderness? So the wilderness is this large tract of second growth forests. That, I mean, depending on who you talk to and what time period you're talking about, you know, I've heard estimates of 70 and 150 square miles, and it was land that had been clear cut in the early Republican period, so 1700s and earlier, for tobacco farming, for cotton farming, and for mining, gold mining initially, and then iron mining later. Over time, the fields went largely fallow, or at least not profitable anymore. Cotton and tobacco will do that. If you don't properly rotate crops out, they can be extremely damaging to the soil. The mines stopped being profitable, so a lot of the landowners left, basically abandoned the land, and allowed it to grow back into this snarl of second growth scrub oak and underbrush. It was an extremely dense area, very difficult to move through, very few roads, and so even for the relatively rural area of the state of Virginia at the time, it becomes known as the wilderness of Spotsylvania County, just due to its sort of the impenetrable nature of this gnarled second growth forest.
I think it's a great description. Yeah. And that to maneuver an army through that, first off, is just, I think it's a feat alone. You know, like you really do have to have some type of good command structure, but you really have to rely on your troops' discipline to be able to follow orders and really stick to, like, you know, closing their ranks, making sure ranks are absolutely as tight as possible, because the minute those break in a woods where you have maybe a 10-foot visibility, and I mean that's giving you some yards there, mixed with the smoke of battle. Right.
That's before you've got tens of thousands of men firing black powder, and the black powder smoke being trapped because of how thick the woods are. There's nowhere for it to go.
That's horrible. I think too, like, one thing that I've really kind of taken away from the wilderness as I began studying now, I've really not touched it this much, and I'm guilty of this, so I'm going to be the first to admit it. This is the last of the four that I actually decided to kind of get into. I blame Spotsylvania for that, so no offense, Spotsy. I'm not trying to like throw you under the bus or nothing, but I definitely blame Spotsylvania. There was just so much to try to take in there and learn, and I'm still even going on and on and on about Spotsylvania. But the wilderness just kind of sat on the back burner. I gave a few tours out there at the No Turning Back tour. There was no thrill whatsoever at that point. But I never appreciated the severity of the wilderness, because honestly, I never truly understood it. I still don't. I mean, it's one of the most confusing battles of the war. But it is one of those, and I think that's something to really kind of just throw at. You know, we think it's confusing. We think it's hard to understand or make sense of. How the heck do you think a soldier would have felt who's witnessing this in 64, and who's witnessing what they've seen maybe from 61 all the way to 64, and being at these large campaigns, some coming in from the west? You've got Longstreet returning from Chickamauga, which we'll get into in a minute, or that portion of Georgia, Tennessee. Command changes by drastic measures, absolute drastic measures. But I think there's a lot. But I think there's a lot with that ties into it, to kind of tell the story about how everything is changing. And you see it formulating and changing as the year starts with a new commander.
For the overall army, not for the army.
Correct. Correct. This is for the...
people get confused.
Mm-hmm. He's holding a position... Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so so of course we're talking about Ulysses S. Grant,
Mhm.
who was promoted to lieutenant general in the spring of 1864, the first full lieutenant general since George Washington himself. Now, George Washington never technically held the rank of lieutenant general during the Revolution. That was something he was actually given post-war, but nonetheless, the first lieutenant general since George Washington. And he's put in charge, and he's made general in chief, which was a sort of informal command position that existed within the U.S. Army at the time. Closest monitor equivalent would be the Army Chief of Staff. That basically put him in charge of, at this point, for all intents and purposes, the entire U.S. war effort. So he's not in charge of one field army; he's in charge of all the field armies: the Army of the Potomac, the Army of the Tennessee, the Army of the James, the Army of the Valley. He's got all of these forces that he's juggling. Now he makes his headquarters in the field with the Army of the Potomac, something which, on one hand, it's good. He doesn't want to be stuck in an office in Washington. That wasn't his style. But it wasn't something that Meade was super thrilled about necessarily.
Oh no. Meade.
Yeah, he'll write a letter to his wife, actually saying, "Oh, now that Grant's in charge and Grant's here, everyone's going to forget about me. Everything good that happens will be attributed to Grant. Everything bad that happens will be attributed to me."
I want to touch on that as we do another episode later on during this series when it comes closer to the Massaponax Church, because there's a really good picture of Grant and Meade sitting over on a pew outside of the Massaponax Church. And in this picture, Grant is leaning over Meade, completely overshadowing Meade, and pointing on a map and directing that, while there's pretty much all the other staff of the Army of the Potomac sitting all around every single one of them. And with that being said, to me, that just completely and totally describes the dynamic between Grant and Meade. Grant's over his shoulder, standing over everything, directing the war effort, while Meade's still directing his portion. It's a perfect summary of kind of what happened, how it really is.
And there's an argument to be made, especially here at Wilderness, that Meade and Grant kind of, as they're trying to figure out what this command relationship is actually going to look like, how much direct control is Grant actually going to exercise over the Army of the Potomac, because, well, he doesn't technically directly command the Army of the Potomac. He is Meade's boss, and he is kind of right there. So if he really wants to, he could just order Meade to do whatever he wants, to order the Army to do whatever he wants.
Right. I mean, Meade offers his resignation upon Grant's arrival to the camp of the Army of the Potomac. Movie straight, and Grant, because of that, I think is wowed so much. He's like, "Wow, okay, yeah, you're staying. I like you." And because you're automatic assume. Sorry. But
yeah, because Meade is making the assumption that with the Army of the Potomac being the U.S. Army, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it is the U.S. Army that is in the papers the most. It is the premier and the largest of the U.S. field armies, and it's facing arguably the most dangerous Confederate army. Meade, of course, assumes that Grant is going to want to put one of his own in command of the army, Sherman and Sheridan, whomever.
Sure, he had a great selection to choose from, plethora at that. But
he did. But ultimately, Grant will choose to leave Meade in command of the army, and Meade will remain the nominal commander of the Army of the Potomac through the rest of the war.
Mm-hmm.
With that said, maybe we should get into setting up the overall strategic situation in the spring of 1864, and how the two armies find themselves in Wilderness in the first place.
So there's a separation between the two armies, which is a wonderful little rapid river. It's actually known as the Rapidan. That's why I like to say rapid. But it is very rapid, so it's not wrong in saying that as a description either. It is not something you're going to just wander across, meander across, and smack Lee in the face with your musket. It's not that easy to get across. In order to do this, we see a failed attempt later in 63, before the Overland campaign actually begins. There's an attempt to get at Lee's forces, who are entrenched on Clark's Mountain to begin with. A very formidable position. Their earthworks are like bastions, fortress-like, not something to just throw men at. And in this area of Virginia where they were at, it is not necessarily the Wilderness. This is very flat area as well in front of these hills and mountains. And with that being said, when Meade has some of his forces across the Rapidan River and lined up to attack Robert E. Lee at a place in a battle, maybe not really a battle, but an accident, you could call it the Mine Run campaign. We'll just go ahead and call it that for argument's sake there. The Mine Run campaign is a culmination of, I think, probing action, trying to feel out how strong Lee's lines actually are, and an almost attempted just annihilation of its own army. I mean, it would have been suicide to send those troops against the entrenchments Lee had in front of them. Absolute suicide. And that says something, because what that really alludes to is also we're kind of putting ourselves back into a situation where we're looking at very similar scenarios as we are in the Winter of Discontent, or the Valley Forge of the Army of the Potomac in 1862 and 63, where there's a very formidably dug-in Confederate force on the opposite side of a river separating it. You've got a Union army somewhat in shambles. Now, this time it is coming off the heels of a Gettysburg victory. Now, there is a lot of smaller things that are happening on the way to the Mine Run campaign that takes place in 63, but ultimately there's kind of a high with the Army of the Potomac. There is this sense that Meade has just brought them a victory, and I think the country really expects a follow-up very, very soon, and the spring of 64 is going to be that follow-up. But as you have said, oh, absolutely, he did. He's had dealt with McClellan. He's dealt with people the likes of Burnside. I'm not even going to mention John Pope, for goodness sakes. There's just so many different commanders he's already had to just like pick and choose from that really kind of failed him. There's a quote somewhere, and I'm not remember where exactly I have read this, but I think it one of God, I can't remember, Noah somebody. I mean, Noah Trudeau's book. I believe he writes this quote about Lincoln telling a story about all commanders needing to require an impossibility of Lincoln, and he was just waiting to see what Grant's impossibility was. And Grant's asking for he needed more cavalry, and he's asking about the unassigned troops meandering around Washington, but there's not enough horses. And Grant says something to the like of, well, can you just like retrain them as infantry and send them to me? Of course, he's talking about the heavy artillery batteries that play very instrumental roles coming in the later campaign. But that's exactly, I think, Lincoln really wanted to see in somebody. So instead of making it an impossibility and blaming the U.S. government, Grant's like, okay, cool, train him as infantry and send him to me. He's offering a solution instead of an impossibility. And that's what Lincoln wanted all this time. He wanted somebody, yeah.
He wanted a general-in-chief who would get all the armies coordinated together.
Right.
Something that he had tried to get McClellan to do when he was general-in-chief, but that had failed. He struggled for years to get Henry Halleck
Don't get me
to
started.
do that, which was
Don't even get
fundamentally incompatible with Henry Halleck's understanding of what his position was.
Dude, he couldn't even number his notebook. Come
he
on.
basically saw himself as the Army's chief bureaucrat. His job was to make sure all the paperwork was properly signed.
Fails at that, dude.
But with Grant, he gets a general who recognizes that the U.S. Army has this very significant advantage in manpower and field armies, and if that they attack all of their Confederate counterparts more or less simultaneously, that they can prevent the Confederacy from shifting troops from one theater to the other, and thus maintain that numerical superiority, which is something that the Army had not necessarily done up to this point. So Grant builds this whole grand campaign for the spring of 1864, where each of his major field armies is given a specific goal from Washington. I mean, not technically Washington, because Grant's not in Washington, but you know what I mean, where it's like, up to this point,
he's a representative of Washington. You're right.
yeah. So I mean, up to this point, the field army commanders were given kind of vague direction from the War Department, but unless they screwed up, were pretty much left to make their own theater level decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And Grant is like, no, you are not a field army operating in isolation. You are a part of a larger national strategy, and this is what your role in that national strategy is. So you've got the Army of the Gulf, who's supposed to go up and hit Shreveport, and you've got Franz Siegel in the valley, whose job is to go down the valley. Well, technically up the valley because the valley is upside down. Go south along the valley and cut Virginia off from one of its last major food supplying regions. You've got Sherman's army group, whose job it is to take out the Confederate Army of Tennessee and Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's last great manufacturing centers. You've got the Army of the James, who is tasked with threatening Richmond from the east, from the Virginia Peninsula, forcing the Confederates to waste troops defending the city when the city is not the most immediate strategic goal of the U.S. Army. And then, of course, you've got the Army of the Potomac, which is given a task which is quite familiar with attempting at the very least at this point, which is destroy the army of Northern Virginia and take Robert E. Lee off the playing field. And all of these are designed to place maximum pressure on the Confederacy on every front simultaneously, and hopefully bring a swift and decisive end to the war sometime that year, preferably that summer.
Yeah, sometime soon. Like, let's speed this thing up. This is lasting too long. This is economically devastating. The Confederacy's inflated itself twice with, I mean, not twice, but you know what? Numerically speaking, they probably did really inflate themselves like twice. But all these things are culminating to show an end to the war, I think, also as well. So, like, I mean, there needs to be a military push. There needs to be that absolute authority to be shown in order to establish the United States as legitimately whole again. There's enough, I think, support to even have McClellan in office, like you were saying. So this is putting a very big, tense situation on 64 as we're going in for a White House in Washington. However, in Orange County and the Culpeper County, which is just on the other side, so the north side of the Rapidan there, or would that be the north or would that be the west, actually? North.
It's the north.
It is the north, yeah. Okay, I had the right.
Rivers can be weird like that. It's basically the north.
It threw me off for a second. I saw it north, then I'm like, oh, wait a second, the Shenandoah flows. I should not have thought about the Shenandoah and the way it flows, because that's one way to confuse the absolute hell out of you. Because it flows normally, but the people don't say that. If you're going up the Shenandoah, you're going down. If you're going down the Shenandoah, you're going up. Did you know that? So if you're going down the valley, okay, you knew that. Okay, a lot of people don't when I say it, and they get so confused and look at me. It is. Yeah, that's right. So I need to stop thinking about that when I think of Virginia rivers. It's not the same. It's not as weird as the Shenandoah. But the situation on this river, the Rapidan, again, it serves as a natural barrier for that reason. It is a very rapid river. It's not something to cross, especially after the rains that have happened, the recent snowfall that took place before April, all that. The river is still going to be decently high tide. It's not going to be anywhere near where it's a ford. But there are fordable locations, and the U.S. Army Grant is going to try and select locations to cross to bring the Union Army into the area of the wilderness. That area we described to you, that dense second growth forest, 70 square miles of brambles and briars and undergrowth and barely any sunlight reaching through the trees, giving you very little visibility. And it's not favorable to move military men through. It's not favorable to have any type of troop movement through at all. But it is good to screen movements and also to catch people by surprise if needs be. This is exactly the mindset going into the wilderness on the Union side. The reason for the screening and the catching by surprise is to try and draw Lee out of these entrenchments that we spoke about were so formidable that there was not going to be an attack. I mean, the whole entire mine run campaign is called off completely because of the intensity of what they have on that hill, on that mountain. And there's not a possibility of trying to do these like frontal assaults like that against works again. I think they've learned a little bit on how that goes in 62. And there's not necessarily a repeat wanting to happen, even though we see Lee do it himself in that 63 summer. But there's not going to be that repeat. That's not what they want to do. They want to try to find a way to bring Lee out of those trenches. And let's settle a battle at Spotsylvania Courthouse at Hamlet there that's on the way to Richmond, which is where
The whole goal is to get through the wilderness, in between Lee and Richmond, in reasonably open ground, and essentially force Lee to fight them on the ground of their choosing. And in that sense, it's not, conceptually, it's actually not that different than what Hooker was trying to do.
Read my mind.
1963. they're just doing it we're just doing it slightly somewhere else. And
Also, it's Grant.
And with commanders and with generals in command who are a bit more sure-footed in the level of command they have. Let's put it that way.
Grant didn't lose faith in Grant. You know? That didn't happen.
And what we're going to see at the beginning of Wilderness is essentially Lee doing, very similar, conceptually, basically doing the same thing he does at Chancellorsville, which is hitting the Army of the Potomac on the move in ground that at this point he knows he can win a fight on because he had done it 1 year before at Chancellorsville.
He's got a hell of a split in the Wilderness too. He's got Ewell and Hill completely split.
And he's got Longstreet once again absent at the beginning of the campaign. Now this time Longstreet is very much close at hand. He will arrive. We'll get into it later, but he'll arrive later than maybe Lee would have liked him to. But
Agitation
this
was.
time Longstreet is in fact close enough to be a major factor in the campaign, unlike Chancellorsville.
Right, he's not chilling down in Suffolk this time.
No, he's at Gordonsville.
Right, exactly. That's which, if you're familiar with the area, it's not that far off. Especially if you're heading down Route 20.
And the reason why Longstreet was at Gordonsville was because Lee was not. Lee wasn't an idiot. He knew he had a pretty solid idea of what the U.S. was likely to try to do. He just wasn't sure where they were going to try to do it yet. Where they were going to cross the river when they finally went on the offensive. They were going to cross to his now. So Lee is at Culpeper. So are they going to try and cross to the east or to the west? Now, if they cross to the west, they have the Army of the Potomac has the advantage of getting into open ground more quickly, but the road networks aren't as good, and you start bumping up against the Blue Ridge Mountains, which can make large maneuvers, like theater-level maneuvers, more complicated. It also uncovers Washington, which, of course, was not really something that Washington liked when the Army of the Potomac did that. So that's why the decision is made to, partially at least, why the decision is made to cross east of the of Culpeper. But the reason why Longstreet is at Gordonsville is that if the Army of the Potomac does cross to the west, he is better positioned at Gordonsville to react to that kind of movement than he would be if he was kept closer to Culpeper. Of course, in this case, that means that he is slow to arrive when the Army of the Potomac crosses to the east of Culpeper. Almost disastrously so.
It is a disaster, almost. I mean, you get that, like I said, there's this almost failures of mind run. You have a lot of stuff haunting him, I think, too, and maybe giving him a scenario in his head what his army could do. It could go any different way, and I think this close to the end of the war, the way you have to go into a command like this, and again, I'm just using this as a what if and kind of an iffy thing. I think both commanders, I want to say all three because I kind of just have to give Meade some credit in like leading here, and I don't like to just say Grant. I always like to try and include Meade in these things because I think there are some decisions that Meade makes that are important and very imperative to how the campaign plays out. But I think all these commanders know the importance of this upcoming campaign. They have it in their heads. They know the scenarios. They've played it out in their heads left and right. That there's an importance, and it's visual. I mean, the troops even, I think, know it. And I mean, John, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just that the letters you read, the diaries, the primary sources that we have, you can get that from that. It's not hard.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely. I mean, that's true. I mean, it's also true that it seems like every time the Army of the Potomac crossed the river, I mean, a lot of troops were pretty convinced that Chancellorsville was going to be the last battle of the war before at the beginning of the campaign. So. There is definitely a recognition. Maybe not so much before Wilderness, but definitely after Wilderness. That
Yeah.
Is going to be different.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think that might be more appropriate. Maybe you should be saying that Wilderness gives them that mindset of, oh shit, this is real. This is going to be very serious. So, I mean, that gives you an idea of kind of the intensity. But I guess where we're back at is the scenario of where the armies are currently strategically located and what's about to happen. So we know the idea. Grant wants to get around Lee by getting to ground of Grant's choosing to bring Lee out to fight. He has chosen Spotsylvania Courthouse as that location in order to get to Spotsylvania Courthouse without having a very large brawl with Lee. Wilderness was the idea. Obviously, it's not how it ends up working out.
No. And part of that is because of some failed timetable planning on the part of Meade and Grant.
Oh, good call. I actually wasn't even going to think about the timetable. Just even the timing. And go ahead. Good call.
So when Meade and Grant are planning the campaign and trying to figure out how quickly they need to move through the wilderness, they are at least in part assuming that Lee will move at about the same rate he moved during the Mine Run campaign, which by their math would have given them an extra day to get through the wilderness than they actually ended up having. So they would have had basically 2 days to get the army across the river and through the wilderness to Spotsylvania, when they really ended up with just slightly less, right at basically just 1 day. So they're operating on a slightly bad timetable. They underestimate, as is a pretty common mistake made by U.S. commanders in Virginia. They underestimate just how quickly Lee can move when he decides to move.
Yeah.
So kind of like at Fredericksburg, or to a lesser extent, where the fighting breaks out in Chancellorsville, there is this failure on the side of the U.S. Command leadership to fully account for just how aggressive Lee really can be when he decides to be, which is more often than not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what leads to this meeting engagement that takes place in the wilderness beginning on the morning of May 5th, with the Army, the U.S. Army of the Potomac has crossed the Rapidan and Rappahannock Rivers at a couple different locations. They've made really good movement. The U.S. Second Corps is basically at Chancellorsville. U.S. Fifth Corps is at the Brock Road, the Germanna Plank Road, Orange Turnpike intersection around Wilderness Tavern in Elwood. U.S. Sixth Corps is getting ready to cross, and the U.S. Ninth Corps is right behind them.
Mm-hmm.
And if their timetable was accurate, they would have had basically all day of the 5th to complete the movement through the wilderness into Spotsylvania Courthouse. Of course, they wake up the morning of the 5th, and that is not what ends up happening.
No. The headquarters, Governor K. Warren is going to select. I want to talk about that really quickly before we get too much into the fighting. It's a very important thing, and it's going to be my plug for preservation this episode, because I always have to do that at least once, maybe twice, just for good measure. But Elwood Manor is owned by the Lacey's at the time of the Civil War. It's been built many years before that, so it's been in the hands of a very familiar face to a lot of our folks that may know a lot about Chatham Manor or have some of the history down pat with that. Churchill Jones, going to be one of the first owners, if not the original. William Jones, I believe, is the original owner. That house saw some very significant hospital scenes when it was under the care of Dr. Black from the Confederate Army in 1863, when it served as a Confederate field hospital. And not only does it serve as a Confederate field hospital, but it is also a very controversial site, as it is, in fact, supposedly the burial site of Stonewall Jackson's arm. The one that was amputated. The only one that was amputated. I mean, dude only had 2 arms. But the one that was amputated at Chancellorsville due to the wounding he was unfortunately fated to sustain because of the 18th North Carolina Infantry. Can't blame him too much. There was a lot going on to cause him, but okay, another story for another day. But this already has the arm buried there at the time, as Warren is setting up his headquarters at this place. Now, I'm not going out there and digging up the arm or anything, maybe not even acknowledging that. I definitely think he has more on his hands at the time than Jackson's, because Jackson's is in dirt. He doesn't need that hand. But the reason I want to bring up Elwood is because there's going to be some number muffing in Elwood, and I want to talk about that at the end of the episode just a little bit, about the Warren number nuffing. Wow, that was going to be great. I almost messed that one up. Number muffing, and why that happened, and why he decided to just kind of make himself look a little better, and what that does to the trust he actually kind of loses from Meade. And in fact, Meade used to trust Warren up to this point very, very much, and almost as a confidant. I mean, you could really even point to a few instances where that is the case, specifically after Gettysburg, and if you see Warren elevated to corps command the way he does. Warren's not going to be the corps commander we think he's going to be. Not a performer at all. Well, maybe a performer, but not a deliverer. And I think that's important to the campaign as well, because he has many instances where he's tasked with very important assaults or defenses, and he, again, doesn't deliver. So Elwood has some importance in multiple things. We'll talk about that as we go on. But just to know that Elwood is, or the Lacey House is what we're going to be referring to, kind of also to get us a little oriented to the battlefield. It's going to be sort of a very strategic area. In fact, across the Orange Turnpike that bisects Saunders Field, which is going to be the field just directly in front of the Lacey farm there. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the Lacey's actually have some type of ownership of that and are renting it out to somebody from New York at the time. And this area is also concentrated to headquarters because we have Grant setting his headquarters up just across that turnpike, across from the Lacey House or the Elwood Manor. And Grant's pretty close to the front, as Lee will be close to the front over there along the Plank Road, the Orange Plank Road. On the opposite side of the battlefield is a split battlefield. So you have your Union command falling into place along the Orange Turnpike. You fall into place with Confederate forces if you're on the Orange Plank Road. So I want to make sure those roads are brought up and differentiated, because they are two very different roads on very different parts of the battlefield. And you're going to hear a lot of orange roads throughout this talk, and to know that the Orange Plank Road and the Orange Turnpike. Turnpike has the Union command on it. Plank Road has the Confederate command. That's just an easy way to understand it, because there's a lot of intense fighting that happens on both of those roads and in the woods in the middle between and on the other opposite sides of those roads. So the reason I want to bring up the command is because when I talk about each force, we want to talk about two separate fights, and we're going to talk about the Battle of Saunders Field. Think Orange Turnpike, think Union Command. When we talk about Tap Field, when we talk about the Brock Road intersection, and when we talk about some of the trenches in between that, Orange Plank Road, Confederate headquarters. Should help a little bit. It helped me learn, and maybe it'll help you just a trick. Anyways, let's start talking kind of 5th Corps moving forward towards Saunders Field. Saunders Field's very scrubby. It's a very welcome thing for a lot of, if you're a military wanting to bring out a battle in an open field, because it's one of those very few clearings that you actually have in the wilderness. There's not many. That opens up a few options for the armies. You have an instance where you can now effectively deploy artillery, because if you're fighting in the woods that have that 10-foot visibility, that have gullies and hills and streams and rough-shotted swamps all over the place, you're not really in any type of ground to effectively utilize your artillery at all. So when you bring your armies to a clearing, and you can now just unlimber your artillery and lay down some rounds, you've got a advantage, if you will. And sometimes you don't. We'll see that in Saunders Field. But predominantly, the mindset of a military officer is that you have an advantage with artillery if you bring it to an open field. More so than you do in the woods. I think this is in the mind of a lot of the officers as they're probing the wilderness for any signs of Confederate forces or presence. There are cavalry forays all along the days of May 4th and 5th that are going to make contact with Confederate cavalry and some Confederate skirmishers that are the head of Lee's line. Lee has seen the movements from his position on Clark Mountain. He could tell that it was not just a relocation of camp by the way the Army's march moved and hit all the fords, and the sympathy he had from a lot of the civilians in the area generated a lot of flooded messages about Confederate or Union forces all in the area moving on this ford. They're moving on the Germanna Ford, the Ely's Ford Road, the Ely's Ford from Chancellorsville. You know, these are very familiar names. These are very familiar places to the Union Army and the Confederate Army, and they're being utilized once again. Almost a year to the day. I mean, they are just so close for it being exactly a year. So Lee is obviously going to capitalize on what he thinks. I don't know if he really wants to consider it an initiative, but I do think Lee is kind of handed that when he has that information and Grant is maneuvering through the wilderness, and it kind of slows like molasses, especially when we want to talk about the 9th Corps and Burnside.
Well, I mean, what it comes down to Potomac get through the
Oh,
woods
absolutely.
unmolested.
Yeah.
That is, he, at least in this immediate area, if he's going to nip this offensive in the bud, he's got to do it fast, and he pretty much has to do it here. Um, this is where he is going to be able to. He knows this land very well because they're literally fighting on top of some of the some parts of Chancellorsville.
Exactly.
That
Frank Wilkerson's sitting by a campfire.
in the area
Right.
that Lee is operating in specifically was at various points part of his rear line.
No, sure.
So this is land he's familiar with.
Hmm.
This is land that he knows, if used correctly, can help level the playing field between him and the larger U.S. Army. So if he's going to stop the offensive, he pretty much has to do it here. Of course, he's also arguably assuming that this is going to be still follow the paradigm that the war in Virginia pretty much had up to this point, which is the two armies maneuvered to a major engagement, and after that major engagement, they either lost or they won it, and they went back home and licked their wounds for a couple of months. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but we're going to find out that that's not true.
It isn't. Now, when you look at kind of how Saunders Field is laid out, we're going to look at it in the terms of it being divided right down the middle with the Orange Turnpike. Confederates are coming from the direction of Gordonsville, from the, on that side, what it was today is Constitution Highway or Route 20. And they're the dust cloud. I think we start with that. There is a welcome sign to observers or scouts or spies, what have you. And that's a cloud of dust, very, very large cloud of dust. Do you know what that indicates? That indicates troop movement. What do you think is seen on a dry, dusty road in the middle of the wilderness? A big old cloud of dust. Belonging to Ewell's Corps. Second Corps. The very same corps Stonewall Jackson commanded in those woods in 1863. Brought right back under the command of another amputee. However, Jackson never got to actually operate as an amputee. He was, unfortunately brought to Guinea Station, and at Guinea Station he would die on May 10th, 1863. However, Ewell does not die. Ewell gets shot and his leg is amputated. He's shot again in the wooden leg at Gettysburg, barely even noticing it. It's different man in command. Now, Ewell is still sort of, I wouldn't say new to command, but he was commanding at Gettysburg, obviously. He had his little, moment, possibilities, chances. But now he's not really living up to Lee's expectation. To make matters worse, Ambrose Powell Hill is separated from Ewell's Corps on the Orange Plank Road and moving into place. Now, Lee knows how dangerous this split is, especially if the Union forces recognize how large of a gap is in between the Confederate lines. If they can seize the initiative on securing that gap and attacking both armies that are now divided, that could spell destruction for the Army of Northern Virginia, at least until Longstreet can get his butt up from Gordonsville. Lee knows this, he sees the importance of that, and he's going to defend in ways by digging in and fortifying his positions.
Yeah, his specific orders to Ewell are not to bring on a general engagement until A.P. Hill on the Plank Road is up and in line, because he knows he's outnumbered, but he also knows that the wilderness tends to favor the defender in an engagement. So he doesn't want Ewell to bring on a full fight until Lee has the army all up and concentrated.
And like you've said, we're not seeing Longstreet in the direct vicinity to bring up any of that support to lessen that gap. So that gap's going to play a very important role in the play out of the battle.
Of course, it's also true that at the beginning of the engagement, the U.S. Army has a gap of its own to worry about.
A very large gap of its own, absolutely.
The U.S. Second Corps was already quite a ways farther south than the rest of the army. They had begun their movement first thing in the morning. They were farther to the east, so they didn't have to worry about this this worrying report of Confederates coming down the road. And it becomes very obvious very quickly that the Confederate Third Corps on the turnpike um, basically have a straight shot to the intersection of the turnpike and the Brock Road. And if they take that intersection, they can cut the U.S. Army in two. They can isolate the U.S. Second Corps, and that's generally a bad thing in military circumstances. So both armies are dealing with these concerns about a gap. Now, of course, when Grant gets word that there are Confederates, Grant does a Grant, right? He immediately, well, actually, interestingly enough, it's Meade who immediately orders Warren, commander of the U.S. Fifth Corps, to immediately attack.
Right. Think David Bowie under pressure.
Yeah, the Confederates. And this is not something that the Army of the Potomac is necessarily used to. These immediate swift assaults. Over the course of the war, the Army of the Potomac had developed a relatively conservative organizational culture when it came to operating, and part of that was a development of this belief that the Army of the Potomac, it was more important that ultimately it was more important to keep the Army of the Potomac intact and extant than it was to actually win battles, in the sense that the Army of the Potomac was the shield for Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as it simply existed, Washington would be safe.
What does that mean for numbers, John?
Well, that means that the Army of the Potomac is huge by comparison to the Army in Northern Virginia.
I guess I should be more specific.
20,000 men.
What does it mean for the replacement? What numbers are expendable? Who has expendable numbers? That's something we should probably touch on.
Well, I suppose that depends on who you talk to. Now, it's arguably the Army of the Potomac, being much larger, can absorb shocks in the ways that the Army in Northern Virginia simply can't.
It can, and I think that's reflected at the Wilderness as well. There's a whole nother level of intensity with the Union Army when they make it to the Bloody Angle than they're seeing, ever. Also, you could say that for the Confederates, too, because it's just the situations that these armies are now faced with that they haven't been. Constant campaigning, constant marching, constant fighting, zero sleep. It's hell on earth, mentally, physically, emotionally. It is an absolute mess. Total all-out war. And the Wilderness, again, does see the opening of that. And with the armies separated the way they are, it's just a perfect scene to begin the nightmare and kind of culminating on how nasty the Civil War can really get.
Yeah, but what you're seeing here at Saunders Field is sort of this conflict between Grant's way of waging war and the Army of the Potomac's more conservative nature. If it had been up to Grant, when the order to attack was given, good old Griffin, the division commander, who was the only guy really in a position to attack when that order was given, would have gone in immediately.
Yeah.
First thing in the morning, immediate assault, try and catch the Confederates off guard. We'll funnel the rest of the troops to you as we can, and as long as we keep the pressure up, eventually they'll make a mistake we can exploit, right? Like that's how Grant fights. To dumb it down, whereas that's not really how the Army of the Potomac did things. The Army of the Potomac did not like to send in piecemeal assaults. Even, I think maybe sending an entire division is maybe not technically piecemeal, but I think you understand what I'm getting at.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're like, no, we don't know what's to our front. Ward, in particular, was relatively new to Corps Command. He was the officer who had been in charge of what was supposed to be the assault on the mine run defenses in 63, and it convinced me to call those off. So Warren does not like attacking when he doesn't know exactly what's to his front. He doesn't like attacking when he doesn't have all of his guys in a nice row. And that's a very Army of the Potomac way of doing things. You get all your guys together, you get them in one concentrated huge battle line, and you all go at once with maximum force. So what ends up happening is Warren delays, right? He gets the order to attack, I want to say around 9 in the morning. He's going to delay. He's going to stall. He's going to try and get a better idea of what's to his front. He's waiting for the U.S. 6th Corps under Sedgwick to get to his right, so he can attack with Sedgwick. He's trying to get all of his divisions in line, so if he does have to attack, he can attack with his entire corps at once. It doesn't help that he's got a portion of his force under Crawford down at the shooting farm, doing an excellent job of not following orders and returning to extend his lines. But of course, it's not just me making this decision. You've got Grant kind of looking over his shoulder, and Grant is starting to get a little upset that, hey, didn't you order Warren to attack? It's noon, what's going on? And so essentially Warren is forced to attack, but you end up with sort of the worst of both worlds, right? If Warren had forwarded the order to Griffin and ordered Griffin to attack immediately, maybe they catch Ewell off guard, Ewell's troops were still arriving, maybe they get him backed up on the road, who knows? You know, there's a number of possibilities that happen. If they do wait longer for Sedgwick to arrive, which happens in the mid-afternoon, they go forward, they have maximum force, they outnumber Ewell, or at least have equal numbers, and maybe they just sweep him off the field by sheer force. The problem that you have, though, is the attack happens before Sedgwick arrives.
Unsupported.
Force, but it happens... But it's delayed long enough that Ewell is able to get his forces into line, and more importantly, he's able to entrench.
Correct.
So you get an attack that happens faster than it maybe normally would have under the normal Army of the Potomac operational leadership, but not soon enough to be relevant, but not soon enough to be effective, and not late enough to have to take place with full force. So you in a sense, you almost have Grant and Meade kind of diluting each other here. Where it's like, you've got Meade, who, you know, for all intents and purposes, is an Army of the Potomac man, right? He's very much a general in the Army of the Potomac style. He's arguably the most competent of the Army of the Potomac style generals to lead the Army at this point, but he is an Army of the Potomac man.
Yeah.
And you've got Grant, who is this hyper-aggressive, general who places maximum emphasis on the initiative. He's very Lee-like in a lot of ways. And in a sense, you have these two officers at the Wilderness diluting each other, leading to a kind of, as rather than the best of both worlds, a kind of worst of both worlds as they're figuring out how exactly this command relationship is going to work.
Yeah, and that's absolutely, I think, a great statement to kind of bring up there. And what I'm doing, sorry for pausing, I'm actually trying to find a May 5th map really quickly just to throw up in the stream. I have one I just saved, and it seems like it's eluding me in my browser here. I do apologize for that, but it's not the greatest one in the world, but it's not a bad one either. It's just one that kind of really helps understand where we're looking at, but it does not want to show up. That's not good. Give me one more minute. John, do you have anything else you want to add really quickly while I'm looking for this? About May 5th before I start. So I want to talk about Bartlett really quickly, and then I want to talk about the Iron Brigade just for a quick second, talk about how like it's their kind of the first time we're seeing the Iron Brigade break due to the fact that there's new troops, of course. But I mean, it's also kind of intense that it causes that, and it's you go to the side of the field that they're attacking on, but we still kind of have to start about the attack in Saunders Field, I think, before we go into the Iron Brigade, because it is directly attributed to what's happening in Saunders Field.
Yes.
So I guess we could paint the picture with Bartlett first.
Go ahead.
All right. So while I'm looking for, you know what? Before I put the map up, I'm just gonna give us this because this is cool too. Saunders Field picture, hell yeah, from 1800s time period picture. Hold on 1 second, John. I don't know if you have it pulled up there or not, but it's definitely something to look at. That's the Orange Turnpike right there. And one little fun fact, I know you can't see it, but if you look into the close to the top of the photo here, that is now should be in your view, I hope. If you look at the little white blob at the top, that is actually what is later going to be known as Wilderness 2 Cemetery. And it's kind of interesting that you can see the picket fence from this view in this picture, actually. But it's there. And that is where some of the dead of the wilderness that were just exposed to the elements and laying there and were reinterred around 1866. So that's what that would be there. It's kind of grim, but that's the wilderness for you. Anyway, Saunders Field, you get the idea. It is bisected by the Orange Turnpike. It is a scrubby little field. The side you were looking at there, okay, so now imagine this. This is kind of the scenario we're facing to. The Confederates are entrenching. We have talked about you having the time to be able to dig in and build these fortifications to a really good, sizable line that has been constructed by Confederate forces, even including down the hill. But in the immediate sector of Saunders Field, the Confederates are fortified. The Union are not at this point. They are moving to attack Saunders Field. When the attack is launched, it is launched on both sides of Saunders Field. So the north and the south side both will see separate attacks. Okay, what I mean by that, for example, Griffin is obviously in the command there in the middle. He's going to have regiments in command. We have Rice on the south side. We have Stone, Cutler, Bartlett. All of those guys are going to be under the Iron Brigade. And on the north side of the turnpike, you see the likes of Ayers, Leonard, Upton, Russell, Brown. That's the 6th Corps coming in later in the afternoon, or on the 5th. But, because we do see Sedgwick get in there. But this whole field will see lines extending all the way across. So this initial one that we're about to talk about doesn't really necessarily have that whole entire battle line all the way intersecting the Spotswood Road down to just what today would be Lake of the Woods. There's more of a smaller, concentrated action in Saunders Field and the outlying area. But as we see the day go on May 5th, towards the late afternoon, there are going to be lines extending very, very, very far into the wilderness and attacking all along this front, with Saunders Field just kind of being that midway point, that center of the battle that's happening on the north side of the battlefield. The southern side of the battlefield is on the Orange Plank Road. Arguably, these assaults are really happening in concert with each other, if I'm not mistaken. They're not completely far off from exploding at the same time. Hancock's 2nd Corps, moving along the Brock Road, the Germanna Plank Road, crossing Brock Road onto the Orange Turnpike, runs into Confederates under Heth. Harry Heth, however you want to say his name. We're just going to call him Heth right now. When he attacks along that road, Confederates are well entrenched at first, but the overwhelming size of Union forces detrench them, or give them out of their trenches. They sent back, scurrying to a stronger position. And at the beginning of the phases of combat that take place on May 5th, the Orange Plank Road sector is more of an ebb and flow type battle, whereas the Union goes scurrying back away from the Confederate earthworks at first. After making some decent breakthroughs on the south side and a little bit on the north as well, they end up falling back to positions where they started their march. Why? John, do you want to help break down this assault really quickly, and then we can talk about what's going on with the Iron Brigade after we talk about the middle of the field?
Sorry, catch me up to speed. I was replying to a comment on the Facebook.
Nope, that is quite all right. I was saying that when we're talking about moving here to the Saunders Field segment, I was kind of giving them a background of what the assaults are going to look like and how they're lined up, since the map's really being funny and I can't get it up right now on the thing here. But you're looking at trying to describe the action that's taking place on the initial assault. So when the go is given and the Union Army break off across the field with the 140th New York and their wonderful Zouave uniforms go charging forward, Stafford, Stewart, and Jones and Walker's Confederates, Hayes flanking them on the other side. Tell us about that.
Well, so Sedgwick, sorry, not Sedgwick. Warren pretty much immediately runs into a whole number of problems.
Right.
Probably the most important problem was that Ewell's lines were longer than his. If you can sort of imagine, sometimes if you can imagine two pieces of string, like one piece of string is 6 inches long, and the other piece of string is, say, 10 inches long. Well, if you push the 6-inch piece of string into the 10-inch piece of string, what happens to the edges on the 10-inch piece of string? They wrap around the shorter string. Well, that is essentially what happens to Warren's line as they go forward. They not only are they being fired from on the front, but because they have the shorter lines, especially on the northern end of Saunders Field, they end up, the fancy military term is enfilade or enfilade fire, where they've got Confederates shooting down the partially or fully down the length of the battle line rather than just at the front of the battle line. So that's problem number one, and that's already a pretty big one.
Yeah.
Problem number two, especially again on the north, the Confederates are well entrenched, and especially on the north side of the battle line, they are entrenched on, again, fancy military term, the reverse slope.
Right.
Which basically means, so if you imagine you're looking at a hill, the reverse slope is just on the other side of the peak from you. And what this does is it conceals your trenches, conceals your numbers, makes it very hard to actually see what you're doing. Now, it does also mean that you can't necessarily shoot at an attacker during the entirety of the attack. But considering that initially Ewell's job was not to bring on an offensive, concealing his, partially concealing his positions like that made a lot of sense. But what it also means is that when the U.S. troops, the 140th New York, probably most famously, as well as some U.S. regulars to their north, crest the hill as they advance out of Saunders Field, they basically go from not being able to see the Confederates at all to being point blank and basically getting volleyed straight in the face at point blank range. To say that is...
And that hurts.
It hurts. It hurts a lot.
Yeah. That's how you get bodied, dude.
So that's problem number two. Problem number three is just so problem number two is partially related to the topography. Problem number three is just the topography in general. So the wilderness is not flat. It is riven with small creeks and valleys and ravines. And as the U.S. troops went forward, what would happen is they would hit these ravines. They would be a little bit safe. They would stop to try and reform their lines, but they didn't always necessarily reform them square to the original direction of movement. They reformed following the ravine because that's where everybody is safe.
Yeah.
So when they go forward, now they're off kilter. So they're hitting the Confederate lines at oblique angles, which means that diminishes the amount of force they could hit the Confederate lines with. It's causing regiment brigades to break apart from each other, revealing interior flanks that can be attacked by the Confederates. The entire thing is a complete mess, and it falls apart almost immediately because of these problems. There are stories of so when they do finally hit the Confederate battle line, they're exiting, at least in Saunders Field, exiting this clearing into the wilderness proper, if you will. And there are the 140th New York at one point actually breaks through the Confederate lines, but had become so disentangled from the rest of the U.S. battle line that they very suddenly find themselves surrounded on all three sides and very rapidly being completely encircled. So they had to fight their way across the field, through the trenches, through the Confederate battle line, and then just to get away, they had to fight their way back out.
Isn't that fun?
Oh yeah, it's just the greatest.
The greatest.
There's stories from some of the U.S. regulars who are just to the north of Saunders Field, from the 140th New York, of of guys disappearing, like literally disappearing in black powder smoke and just never being seen again.
Mm-hmm.
That is not even to begin to start talking about the fire. That's
The fires.
On the Confederate, starting
Yeah.
directly on at the Confederate battle line, basically on the front face of their trenches. That will spread into Saunders Field and will catch many U.S. and to a certain degree Confederate wounded in that field. And if anybody has seen a bushfire, a brush fire, recently cut corn really burns.
Mm-hmm. Not to mention the dry ground. I mean, we mentioned that there was a little bit of rainfall and there may have been a little bit of snow beforehand, but at this point in time, right before the big rains that come later in Spotsylvania later on in the week for these guys, it is absolutely kind of a dry area. The leaves are crackly dry. There's a crap ton of tanglement and just what I would call kindling. The wilderness is a giant tinderbox. It's small branches. It's barely grown, developed trees. It's an immature wood. That's flammable when it's dry. Big time. It's fuel. And the wilderness acts as that charnel place when it comes to the burning, and it drives men to realize, I think, that there's no way out for a lot of them. And this saw a lot of soldier suicide in the middle of the woods, because they'd rather take a musket to the head instead of, burning alive. And I mean, it's understandable, right? Absolutely, the Union troops are carrying 3 days rations, so they're carrying 3 days ammunition. Now they're stuffing their pockets. 3 days ammunition for them is 60 rounds a day. I believe it was somewhere along the lines of 60 a day. So imagine you are fresh in the fight. You have both pockets filled with rounds. You have your cartridge box all the way filled, and you've got one ball ready to go in your musket, and you are instantly shot and it breaks your leg, and then somehow you catch another one. Your legs are done, and the fire's coming. Your musket's spent. You can't move. The fires hit your cartridge box and those rounds cook. You're a bomb. It's horrific. The 118th Pennsylvania is stationed around the Lacey House the night of May 5th, and they hear the sounds of humans popping. And that popping is the cartridge boxes that were filled with ammo, and it's the fires touching them, and they could hear the screams. They could smell the roasting human flesh. It is very nasty and brutal, and I'm sorry to have to tell you, but that is exactly what these guys are seeing when it comes to the first campaign of the Overland campaign, or the first battle in the Overland campaign in '64. That is how different this battle is getting. And now Chancellorsville, you're seeing fires break out as well, so this isn't necessarily a new thing, but on this scale, it is absolutely a new thing. There's a sense, I believe, with especially the 118th Pennsylvania of overwhelming helplessness. Listening to those comrades burn and not able to do anything for them, it is noted in a lot of the diaries of participants in the Battle of the Wilderness about the sounds and the sights and the smells and the powerlessness that they had over all of it. Frank Wilkerson's a private and very well documents his journey into the Civil War when he joins in late war, so he's arriving just in time for the Battle of the Wilderness, and his memoirs are packed full with just some really good content, really good stuff. Just it's great to read. If you want to get an understanding of a quick, just overall soldier's point of view, the Overland campaign and experiences, I think Frank Wilkerson's a good one to go, and therefore I chose a quote that he decided to give us about what he saw in regards to a soldier, the suicide, and the fires. And he says, "I saw many wounded soldiers in the wilderness who hung onto their rifles and whose intention was clearly stamped on their pallid faces. I saw one man, both of whose legs were broken, lying on the ground with his cocked rifle by his side and his ramrod in his hand, and his eyes set to the front. I knew he meant to kill himself in case of fire. Knew it as surely as though I could read his thoughts." And that's Private Frank Wilkerson, and he writes to us about quite a few things. In fact, just a little plug again for preservation. We have a small parcel of land managed by the VDHR that was supposed to be a Walmart, and it's not. And actually, that ground Wilkerson writes about very notably, noting that was an artillery park. We mentioned how the artillery was virtually useless in the wilderness this is where most of them parked, and this is also where the there was a story about a band of Confederates being captured prisoners, and then during Gordon's flank attack on the night of May 6th, they tried to escape and were gunned down by Union soldiers over there by the Battery Park. Frank Wilkerson gives us that. In fact, I think it is actually Frank Wilkerson that gives us that account, and that was used, I think, as a sign of importance on why that needed to be saved, let alone it just being kind of one of the main, I would consider, focal points of Wilderness. Getting ahead of myself here, but that's again what you're seeing in Saunders Field and similar scenes on the Plank Road. One thing in Saunders Field that kind of baffles me, and I mean, it's the only reason I think it's hard to believe is because of how much I've looked into the Iron Brigade before 1864 and kind of some of the things that they do at like Gettysburg and Antietam and Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. But the Iron Brigade goes against some Alabamians under command of Cullen Battle, and Cullen Battle has been pushed back rather far too, and has some support coming his way now. The support that he's getting is going to come from the Gordon I just mentioned, who does that large flank attack. Gordon's a little bit farther to the rear, and when he hears the sound of battle and his Confederates retreating, that's kind of what was a pun there, sound of battle. They're retreating, and they're moving away from the trenches that they just recently vacated. Gordon is able to tear through the line and just completely shatter the mostly new guys. Most of the guys that are in the Iron Brigade are new. They're fresh. They had not seen combat yet. And what a hell of a battle to start. Like, you couldn't even give them Manassas, not taking anything away from the horror of Manassas, but they have the Wilderness, their first one. Saunders Field. Good God.
Well, the Iron Brigade that went into second Manassas also had the advantage of months of drill and training and team building, in a sense, in the lead up to Manassas. So they didn't go straight to Manassas like a lot of these replacements did.
That's fair. Anything you want to add?
Nope. I mean, just that. I mean, a lot of people like to think of the Iron Brigade as sort of ceasing to exist after Gettysburg, and it's true. The Iron Brigade is never the same after Gettysburg.
Right.
So much of the brigade, and ultimately end up losing. Unfortunately, their all Western status. They are no longer an all Western brigade.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess one way to look at it's kind of a Theseus' ship kind of question, right? Like, how many parts do you have to change before it's no longer the same thing? There are still guys who signed up in '61 who were with the brigade when the war ends in '65, and the brigade continues to provide sterling and exemplary service. So I don't necessarily prescribe to this idea that the Iron Brigade ceased to exist after Gettysburg. It was diminished, perhaps, and not quite the same thing, but it was still the same organization, and they continued, I think, for the most part, to live up to their reputation. Maybe not necessarily at Wilderness in particular, but anyway, that's my opinion.
Oh, I like that. I think that's a fair thing to say. Is like, yeah, they're not gone. I mean, you still have some of the characters, even like Rufus Dawes is at Spotsylvania. He writes about Spotsylvania. He's at Petersburg, and the Iron Brigade doesn't stop doing well either, just because of this horrific battle. I mean, they do some very good stuff in Petersburg too. When we look into '64 and '65, so they're still active, they're still using stuff, they're still fighting, there's still a presence, and that's not just a reflection, I think, of the Iron Brigade just because they break and run. There's so many good, great regiments that have a tendency to break and run at times, especially when it gets hot. The Higgerson farm is just in kind of the middle of both Ewell and Hill, and Doles is going to be in a command there. George Doles is a Georgian and is commanding Georgians as well. Junius Daniels, North Carolinians, follow suit. They've been attacked by Union troops, and both attacks pretty much just dissipate. Saunders Field sees artillery brought in for the first time. That artillery is useless as it fires into the backs of its own men. creating an even more of a hellish scene, I think, for the Union troops who are already trying to get out of this mess that they've accidentally stumbled into. Well, they have stumbled into along the Confederate lines. So there's fires burning out and breaking out all along the Confederate works. There's hand-to-hand fighting on some of the works in particular, funneling a lot of that fighting into larger concentrated areas. And then you also have your own army shooting into your back. Just a lovely day. Can it get any worse? Oh, it absolutely can't. You can get lost. Regiments can fall apart and break and not know where their left or their right is. If you get wounded and the fires break out, we've already mentioned what happens there. That's pretty shitty. That's not fun to have to worry about. If you burn, you burn. That's not where you're going to want to end your life. You're going to end up with muskets. So this is not only messing with your morale, but it's messing with the soldiers watching. This is morale. They're watching men over here blow their brains out with muskets. That's not going well for them. Their day is not good. Confederate or Union. It is intense. It is salacious, and it is for purpose, I think, on both sides. They realize now, once the first 30-40 minutes of battle have been underway, and they're seeing how intense this fight is going to be, I think it just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows in intensity. I mean, it doesn't really peter out until you get to Petersburg, no pun intended. Cold Harbor is like a very big, just kind of like that it all leads to that. Sedgwick's 6th Corps will make itself into the area around Saunders Field just about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of May 5th. He's going to attack Ewell's line. Not in Saunders Field, more so in the woods north of the Pike. And the counterattacks don't really do much. Leroy Stafford's killed. Or excuse me, he's not killed, he's wounded, he's paralyzed. He's out of the fight. He's not fighting. He's not going to return. Orange Plank Road is that southern section of the battlefield, too, that we were mentioning just earlier, where Heth and Hancock are fighting each other. Of course, Heth isn't the Corps commander, but Hancock's Corps is going to construct a very sizable line of trenches along the intersections that also play very favorably into both armies at one point on the 6th, when the fighting ebbed and flows there. But there's another thing, the Vermont Brigade at the Wilderness on May 5th. So we mentioned that the fighting was ebbing and flowing on the Plank Road. So you have Confederates getting pushed back, Confederates pushing the Union back, and the Union falling back and then recapturing ground and pushing the Confederates back again. And the Confederates in turn doing the very same. So again, that's what the ebb and flow is meaning. It's just bouncing from one side of the road to the other, from the other side of the intersection back towards the Orange Plank. I mean, it's nonstop, at least until nightfall.
In a way, what you have happening down at the Orange Plank Road and at the Brock Road intersection is a little bit closer to probably what may have happened when the Turnpike had Griffin gone in immediately, because you have Hancock's Corps coming up the Brock Road, actually moving north, trying to rejoin the rest of the army, trying to secure this intersection, joining a division of the U.S. 6th Corps to George Washington Getty that had been sent there to stall the Confederates long enough for the U.S. 2nd Corps to arrive. And you've got 2nd Corps brigades and divisions, basically going into line of battle and attacking more or less immediately as they arrive. And so you have a lot more dynamic fighting in the sense of movement of ground taken and ground lost happening at the Brock Road intersection, because you have these two forces, where superiority is sort of changing minute by minute as new troops and fresh troops on both sides are funneled in over the course of the day. Now, ultimately, that ends with the U.S. Army not technically where they started, because where they started was quite far away from there, but not having gained any significant ground. But the same is true of the Confederates. The Confederate goal, obviously, was to take the Brock Road intersection and cut the U.S. Army in half, and they've pretty categorically failed to do that. Now, there are some decisions made overnight that will drastically affect how the fighting along this road will develop in the morning. Um, Hancock, just kind of being Hancock, I guess, has his men continue to entrench and improve their works and their line and get reorganized after the fighting for the day and get ready for another fight first thing in the morning. AP Hill's Corps does not do the same thing, at least not universally. AP Hill's Corps had been, the 3rd Confederate Corps had been soundly disorganized by the fighting in the wilderness, as fighting in the wilderness will just kind of do to you no matter what. That's kind of par for the course when it comes to fighting in the wilderness.
Yeah.
It's going to get weird. Men are going to get disorganized, and you're either going to have to form ad hoc units to maintain initiative, which is not really something that either army is necessarily particularly good at any point during the war.
Yeah, or necessarily even prepared to do. I said, or necessarily even prepared to do.
Exactly. So
yeah.
Basically that means every now and again you have to stop and figure out who is who and get everybody back in the right spot so you can keep moving. And the U.S. Second Corps makes sure that work is done overnight, but AP Hill does not. His division commanders are even wondering, hey, shouldn't we be reforming the men? Shouldn't we be making sure everybody's facing the right direction, that everybody is with their units, that they have defensive works? And AP Hill says that there is no need, because he has been told by Robert E. Lee that Longstreet will be up before morning and he will take over the fighting on the southern end of the battlefield. Remember, Longstreet was not here for the first day of the fighting at the Wilderness. He is at Gordonsville. And he had assured Lee that he would be there before the end of the day on May 5th. So the understanding at this point was that AP Hill's men did not necessarily need to go out of the way to prepare to fight first thing in the morning on May 6th, because they wouldn't be fighting first thing in the morning on May 6th. They could rest and reserve their strength and get reorganized in the morning while Longstreet took over the fighting on the southern end of the field, where they would then be moved north to plug that hole that still existed in between the two main battle lines. Unfortunately for
Oh, John, I think we lost you there for a second.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I missed 10 seconds of what you were saying.
Okay. Well, I think most of my point still stands. So essentially, AP Hill is AP Hill's expectation is that he's not going to do any fighting in the morning. That Longstreet's going to take over fighting on the turnpike, and then once that has happened, he can get reorganized and move north to connect Longstreet and Ewell. He will become the new center of the Confederate line. That seems to be the plan moving into May 6th. But the problem is, the morning of May 6th, Longstreet hasn't shown up yet. He's late. He'd been a little over enthusiastic about his own timetable he had given to Lee about when he would arrive. Hancock, on the other hand, is right on time.
That's right.
First thing in the morning, 5 a.m., 20,000+ federal troops jump out of their trenches, screaming bloody murder, and charge the largely unprepared Confederate Third Corps. And to quote the report that Hancock will eventually send to Meade about the status of the fighting on that side of the battlefield, he says he is driving the enemy most beautifully.
Indeed. And there's a little bit of resistance for the Confederates that they can put up, and that's with William T. Polk's 16 guns in the area around Widow Tap. That farm field that we talked about a little bit earlier, but has very notable things happening in it, like at the beginning of the outset of the battle, when there were 3 very notable officers, or I should say commanders, because Lee was amongst them. A.P. Hill was off of his horse, standing alongside of it, as there was another rider. I believe it's not Stewart, is it? Is it Stewart?
I think it is Stewart.
Yeah, it is Jeff Stewart, and there's a Union force that's creeping into Widow tap field just nonchalantly and all. And then pistol shot of the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia and two very, very powerful individuals on the Army of Northern Virginia's muster roll, A.P. Hill and Jeb Stuart. Being that close, Lee Spurs Traveler runs the heck out, followed by Jeb Stuart. A.P. Hill takes a few minutes to get back on his horse and really kind of take in what just happened. That's a good thing to describe how confusing and how easy it is to stumble upon the enemy on the battlefield of the wilderness, but it's also showing you how close the enemy is to Lee at this point. How dangerous this is getting. Because he's hanging out. Remember we said the commanders were looking at headquarters around the areas? Well, this is it. Tap field. There's 800 Texans. This time they're commanded by Brigadier General John Gregg. Any idea who they belong to?
Well, there are only so many, just like there are only so many Western regiments in the Army of the Potomac, there are only so many Texans in the Army of Northern Virginia. So happens they all belong to James Longstreet.
Guess who has arrived? James Longstreet himself, by God, back from Tennessee, and it was a fun trip. He did so well in Tennessee. He did on Chickamauga. Yeah, I mean
Burnside.
Yeah, hey, come on, dude. Burnside. Sorry, I don't want to be mean to Longstreet. I'm sorry, dude. You already have a tiny statue. I shouldn't be mean to you.
I mean, Longstreet, independent command does not suit Longstreet.
No.
He works wonderfully under Lee, but he, like a lot of other really competent U.S. Corps commanders, like Burnside, maybe you could argue.
You can.
To a degree, at least. They're really good at a certain level of command, but once they're on their own, they just don't do very well. And unfortunately, Longstreet, like a lot of other both U.S. and Confederate Corps commanders, just isn't fit to independent command. He works best when he's being managed by someone above him, and he was lucky enough to have Robert E. Lee doing that management for most of his time in the war.
Somebody has to do the job, damn it. Now, those Texans. Lee's going to ask them to go. Lee's going to have his horse grabbed by the reins and pulled and sent to the rear, and then the Texans would go. I'm not glorifying the lead of the rear. I don't think it's that important. Longstreet attacked with other forces in conjunction. Texans drove the initial Union force almost past the Brock Road intersection. So this attack that Longstreet launches is known as the flank attack, or the counterattack. The flank attack formulating actually on this flank while this is taking place. So this is like the beginning of what would be the flank attack that Longstreet leads. This is going to initially drive the Union force so far back from all the ground they've recaptured. Or have captured, because some of this ground they haven't held yet. And at about 10 a.m., Moxley Sorrel is aligning along what we in the park today know as the unfinished railroad. It is pretty much kind of abandoned at the outset of the war because it is, its employees are all in gray. They dropped down their picks and picked up a musket. But anyways, this railroad's still here. There's this cut that has been dug, which you could consider a natural fortification if used as such. But it's on the flank of the Union, the left flank of the Union line. So it's a perfect place to line up a flank attack. Many of these men under James Longstreet have recently received new uniforms. Some of these are darker in color and will prove to be confusing as the day goes on. Fast to William Mahone. Fast tracking here to William Mahone. He is the I would say the hero of Petersburg, which we learn later, but more importantly, a little personal story with Mahone. I'm not in the Civil War or anything, but I reenact with a group called 12th Virginia Infantry. Now, I'm not proud of what they did to Longstreet. They shot that man during this flank attack that's launched at 11 a.m. When it is launched, made much in the fashion as Jackson would have launched an attack in this very same ground. I bring that up because it's just a similar outcome. That's why it's much in the fashion, because Longstreet is wounded by his own troops. Those own troops belonging to the 12th Virginia Infantry under William Mahone. Brigadier General Micah Jenkins. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
A strange amount of
Irony.
Of irony to this. So in May '63, you've got Jackson, a Virginian, who's shot in the wilderness during a flank attack by Carolinians. And a year later, you've got Longstreet, who is a Carolinian, technically a South Carolinian compared to the North Carolinians, but whatever, close enough, who is shot during a flank attack in the wilderness by Virginians. So I guess the Virginians figured that, hey, if the Carolinians get to shoot one of our own generals, then so do we.
Yeah, man, they got a hold of those Swedish assassins. Find that file for me, please. I'm gonna read it again. Micah Jenkins is also killed. Shot in the head. Richard H. Anderson's going to step in for temporary command, which won't be so temporary. Which then will be temporary. You'll understand. What a day for Robert E. Lee. What a wave of emotions within the course of maybe 5 hours.
Yeah, I mean, he goes from seemingly have control over the situation, having stalled the U.S. advance in the wilderness, which was exactly what he was trying to do, to literally being on the edge of losing his army, right? With the U.S. Second Corps driving the way they were, if the Confederate Third Corps had continued to retreat, that would have put the U.S. Second Corps on the side of the Confederate Second Corps.
And it's sad because...
who could have then attacked either up through the wilderness, isolated the Ewell from the rest of the Confederate Army, or continued to push the Confederate Third Corps. I mean, he is literally staring the destruction of his army in the face. Like, arguably the closest he's gotten to this point, at any point in the war. Maybe the only other point that his army has been in this much danger was in the initial stages of the Chancellorsville campaign, which of course he was able to turn that around.
Mm.
So this is going to become a recurring experience for Lee from this point on, where he is basically constantly put in a position where he has to rescue his army from near disaster, and this will be he'll have to do it again, not a week later.
Poor guy, poor fella. The wilderness ain't over yet, but during that attack, I want to point out that Anderson was actually on the far right of that line, actually having some troops waiting within the Nye River to attack McAllister and Brewster on the flank of Hancock. That'd be Hancock's left flank there. Mott, who we will see in Spotsylvania, I will definitely talk about, not having any support is similar like instances here with the Spotsylvania correlation that I'm going to draw again in a future episode later next week or later this week even, because May 8th and 9th are coming up, and Sedgwick starts making fun of people and elephants and doesn't really like the outcome of that too much. But I want to point out that Anderson, who's given command, is actually nowhere really within perfect reach to get this, so it's kind of interesting. I mean, you got to choose someone you know very well, and I'm guessing I was looking at it more of like when you're in that situation, it's then who's in proximity of the fallen commander to take over because they were aware of the situation at hand. But at this point, no, Anderson's being taken from the far right on the Nye River, which is a good distance away from the plank road and the wounding site of Longstreet and some of the officers that are unfortunately killed. And to piggyback off of his Jackson and Longstreet comparisons, I like to consider Micah Jenkins the Keith Boswell that flank firing too. You've similar age, similar importance, similar stature in the army, both killed on the outright of that volley. After that, that attack again, it's going to be some more of the ebbing and flowing until there's an eventual digging in on both sides and kind of really focusing on fortifying those trenches, as we'll see into hours of the 7th of May, following day. The fires haven't stopped burning, by the way. If you thought maybe the fires are just done and they're not happening, no, they're worse. It's still happening. And there are now more bodies in this field, because the fighting on the Orange Plank Road was just absolutely horrendous and it was costly, very, very costly. There was a desperate attempt to try and take that field being Tap Field. Tap Field was desperately counterattacked. There was a desperate flank attack that turned into, what's a good word for that? What did that turn into? Just a blob of bull crap, like just bad fighting, and eventually like crap we need to dig in, because if we don't, we're screwed. I mean, it's tough to really picture all of that. I mean, it really is, and it's not like I'm just sitting here trying to be, wow, it's so tough. It's hard, because you're fighting in situations like that. We can look at maps all day. We can look at the information. We can read the quotes. Yada yada yada. We can do all that. But when it comes down to it, this is still new for everyone in the war. This is a very, very, very intense fight. It is passionate. It is disgustingly gory. I mean, it is that for a reason, and it's because it has been 3 years of this. This is new, though. This is a constant combat. So this scene that you're seeing in the wilderness, this intensity and this emotion put into a battle, is a daily thing in May. May is just an awful month. I mean, for the sake of humanity, May sucks bad. Because I think humanity actually tends to slip from some soldiers at times. There are some crazy instances where there are decent humans, but I mean, few and far between. There's someone that quotes, and I'm not sure if it's Spotsylvania John, so correct me if I'm wrong if you know what I'm talking about, that men don't look like men anymore, they now look like demons. I think that's Spotsylvania, right? Or Wilderness, one of the two.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember like the direct quote, so I'm just very paraphrasing here, but I mean that's very accurate, because that's the kind of attitude, and I think the fighting spirit, if you will, turns in and evolves to in 64 is what that quote describes. Is bitter. You're not sailing a boat across the Little Rappahannock anymore with tobacco in it and getting some good coffee on the way back. Eli will slit his throat if he gets too close to you at this point. It's bad. It's hate. It's tiring of a war. It's wanting this to end, and it's going to any length to let this end. Some regiments are nearing the end of their enlistment. Their term of enlistment was 3 years or the duration of the war, and it's coming upon a lot of it 3 years. You think they really want to go into this fight when they're days away from their removal from the army and away from this hell? They're not absolutely wanting any bit of that. Casualties get so staggering. Grant is pulling heavy artillery away from the defenses of Washington and converting them into simple infantry, throwing them into corps and sending them to the front. He's having a fresh stream of reinforcements on their way, and this will arrive later in Spotsylvania. Not enough time for May 12th, but the days after, we start seeing groups like the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. Write that one down, because I follow them through the rest of the Overland campaign after Spotsy. So we follow them. Elijah Kellogg's my buddy. I really do. He was one of the first officers I ever really studied when I started getting into the Civil War, and I really like Elijah Kellogg, and I want to touch up on him more, so I'm excited for North Anna, Cold Harbor, and late Spotsylvania this coming weeks. It's going to be really fun, and I'm real excited. But we're going to talk about the closing of the Wilderness now. We have left out one big last attack, and that is the Gordon flank attack. The John B. Gordon that was on the other side of Saunders Field, by the way, so yes, don't get confused that you heard him on the south side a minute ago, attacking against some of those Iron Brigade troops and helping to reinforce Cullen Battle's Alabamians when they were broken through and rushed to the rear. He's going to do a flank attack of his own, so there are 2 flank attacks happening in the Wilderness on May 6, 1864. This one's a little different, initially having a little more success than what Longstreet had down there on the Plank Road. And it petered out. It's an evening.
That the court did not get the go ahead to launch the until basically.
That's what I was about to say. The fact that it was evening may be the sole factor of that. So night's coming. What did we not learn the first time in 63 about trying to mess around at night? I mean, you would think this is still fresh in their minds, but there is again, that desperation to try and get at whichever army you can. And if you have that opportunity, I mean, Gordon says this is the greatest opportunity ever presented to Lee's army that was permitted to pass. Absolutely, this could have been so powerful against the Sixth Corps that was there on the other side of Saunders Field. It could have rolled that whole line up like a wet blanket, as we call it, when it gets rolled up. It really could have. I mean, and that's one of the most virtual like senses of it. Really would have looked like wrapping a wet blanket up, almost in like the sleeve of a sleigh, because it was just so easy to fold. But because again the timing, it was bad timing, such a delay. And I mean that can be attributed to the shock of what's happening on the Plank Road. And I mean, Longstreet's gone. That's got to have some type of like just complete and total stalling for the Confederate command.
Well, it absolutely stalled.
Yeah.
On the southern end of the battlefield, giving Hancock vital time to get his own force reorganized.
And he does seize the initiative for that too. That's how he gets that defense to hold, because his entrenchments are stood on by, I believe, the Carolinians are just standing on top of his trenches and getting shot wholesale, like martyring themselves or something. I mean, it's just nuts how the wilderness evolves. But you're right, like those defenses get extremely fortified, but then the Confederates are just like virtually killing themselves on them. However, again, Gordon's attack peters out. The day stops. The smoke and the fires burn. The collapsed line caused a giant panic in Union command and Union forces, sending men crying to Grant. Grant ultimately wails and screams after he is tired of hearing it, and he says, "Oh, I am heartily tired of hearing about what Lee is going to do. Some of you always seem to think that he is suddenly going to do a double somersault and land on our rear, on our flanks, at the same time. Go back to your command and try to think what we are going to do ourselves instead of what Lee is going to do." Obviously, Grant is frustrated at the outcome of the wilderness and the behavior and discipline of his commanders. This will set the stage for an oncoming fight. It's an experiment, if you will. Grant has learned how Robert E. Lee is in combat, how he defends, how he attacks. Lee has learned a little bit about Grant. Learned that he underestimated Grant. Will have to be a little bit wiser and quicker on his feet than he was his first go around. And he does that by what I mentioned earlier in the podcast. I wanted to close on with too, was that road. Now, the armies initially, we talked about Spotsylvania Courthouse. Okay. We said the Spotsylvania Courthouse was that open area, that hamlet, that little village. It's just on the way to Richmond, VA. And both commanders now see the necessity for a push to Spotsylvania. The question here is who goes first? Who gets there first? What happens to who gets there first? Who has the initiative? Is it the Army of Northern Virginia, who has battered Grant all day, a new commander to face, a new intensity that neither army has seen before? Are they going to get there first? Are they going to find a way, especially with the Brock Road and the Turnpike and everything being really kind of in Union control at that point? You don't have those main quick access roads that they do to get there. And this gives the Union the advantage to try to steal a move on Lee and head towards Spotsylvania to win the race against time, because that's exactly what that was. They were racing not each other, but they were racing time. We see that in attacks and styles of defense that take place at Spotsylvania Courthouse, like the formation of the Mule Shoe and the assaults on the Bloody Angle, where Lee is just willingly throwing his men's lives away just to buy a little more time to put a few more logs in a line. Because that in turn will save the Confederate Army. Grant's going to be thinking the same thing. Those bodies that are burned and charred, and the horrors that were sufficed for the Army of the Army of the Potomac and Army of Northern Virginia, respectively, those were all needed. This wasn't done by a commander yet on this front. I mean, no other commander has marched south after this, and this is the most intense as it's got, other than maybe Gettysburg. I mean, the intensity of the fighting, I think, surpasses the intensity of Gettysburg even. Numbers, no, maybe not. But the intensity, absolutely, I think, is completely different. It's a different war at this point. But there's a road that has recently been cut just because of this very reason, that the roads were blocked, and Lee's ordered this road cut. It's we call it the Pendleton Road. I think it's Sandy Pendleton himself that actually oversees the construction of this road. Sandy Pendleton, very familiar with us as he was on Jackson's staff. Sandy Pendleton has his task to cut out this road, leading into backways of Todd's Tavern into what eventually would be the Sarah Spindle Farm Field, or Laurel Hill. I say Laura for some reason, but it's Laurel Hill. Spindle Field, Laurel Hill. Which will see some very serious fighting between Warren's 5th Corps and Maryland Stewart's brigades on May 8th and May 9th, excuse me. There's a race to Spotsylvania, and it's very interesting on how that plays out, and some of the roads that are created to do so, and some of the scenes that are along the march to Spotsylvania via the Brock Road. Confederates are ambushing Union soldiers as they're marching towards Spotsylvania. There's cavalry fights that are very intense, using barricades and dismounted cavalry, mounted cavalry charges, cavalrymen sleeping, getting kicked in the rear by George Meade, fighting and screaming, and even eventually being sent south to go kill Jeb Stuart. So next episode, we will obviously culminate all of that into the beginning of the Spotsylvania Courthouse campaign. I want to close you guys with an image. I mentioned Grant was going south. Now remember, we said the wilderness was on fire. It was. Imagine the army cheering and huzzahing and realizing for the first time that they have a commander that's going to fight. This is almost euphoric for the Army of the Potomac. In fact, I'm not even going to say almost. I'm willing to say it was. It was a hell of a time. 2 days of constant fighting that were bound to test the levels of their humanity by any means. It's not something they forgot. Thomas Hyde had a head from a New Jerseyman explode on his face, and for fully 15 minutes he writes that he was ineffective as a staff officer. This man was pulling the brains and matter of a human body out of his mouth and crevices because his head exploded. And he's telling you about this. Now their soldiers are writing about it. Some are not even writing at all. Normally this would have been a mass covered event. These things of this magnitude would have been written about by everybody. But we're 3 years in a war. Now keep all that in mind as you see Grant marching down that Brock Road while the flames are tunneling him inside of it with a riding party and Union forces moving. Hats are off, cheering, bayonets are up in the air, muskets are fired, and rejoicing spirit. It's a party atmosphere. Because they all know that their commander is going south. And there will be no turning back, in the words of Grant. And that news reaches Washington. I believe Lincoln kisses the reporter that delivers him the news. United States is in for a ride, dude.
And it's going to take a lot more than all summer.
That's the damn truth. It's hellacious. And guys, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope we can really really get into this more. It's not exciting because it's a very sobering topic, but again, it is so important to talk about the Overland campaign. I really dive into it and kind of, I think, and what I like to do with this is we're really getting into the mentality of that too. That's what needs to be talked about, because constant campaigning does something to the human mind that's just beyond comprehension. And then, the next episode I will actually, even on Twitch, have as an adult only. So we're going to have the TVMA rating that goes on Twitch because of some of the stuff that we talk about and some of the quotes that are going to be read, because I really do want to really bring home some of the stuff. That's not something we typically aim to do as historians, to just throw a gore fest at you, because we're not trying to gross you out. We're trying to just tell a story. But I think in order to really grasp what kind of animal Spotsylvania really is, because it's psychological as much as it is physical for these troops. And when you think of psychological in Civil War and the real bad horror, even with those fires and stuff, for some reason, my mind goes straight to Spotsylvania. And it's not just the bloody angle that my mind goes to. In fact, my mind goes to one thing that's more bloodier, or not even bloodier than the bloody angle. It's one soldier that Alexander watches for 3 days attempt to kill himself with a musket that he's wedging in between two branches on a tree and letting fall on his skull, and being unsuccessful for 3 straight days until he dies of just sheer exhaustion and hunger. When I read that quote, I got a new realization of the Overland campaign, because that to me described it. That was the feeling of the Overland campaign. That is the horror that packs. That is what it's going to take to end this war. And some. John, do you have any closing remarks on your end?
No, I think you pretty much nailed it there.
Thank you. No, I'm sorry. I am really passionate about the Overland campaign. Like when we talk about Civil War, I used to be huge into Fredericksburg. That was my favorite one. Then it was Chancellorsville briefly. Like I said, then I got into the Overland campaign. I really started realizing just how horrible it was. And I just maybe there was more to understand, I think, than that's out there even today. I think there's a whole psychology that can be learned from this. And I think it needs to be explored. And we got to find ways to try to bring that out, and how to even approach that, I have no clue. But that's what I'm trying to do with these next couple episodes, is like bring up things that aren't really discussed at Overland campaign. Find some really, because that's the thing. The nasty things are honestly strayed away from a lot, We have to dig and dig and dig and dig and dig to find the good stuff. And I don't mean good stuff like as, oh yeah, it's juicy. I mean the good stuff, I mean like to really understand. Like, and sometimes it's horrible to read. And it is, you put the book down for a minute and you're like, gosh darn. I don't know if I can read this for a while. I got to take a break. And I think it's good if that still happens to you, because if you can just read this stuff and not even be phased, I don't know. It truly does bring some emotions out of people. And again, I'm sorry if it's too passionate for people. I'm sorry, but it is really that much of a story that I think needs to be told. And the fact that you guys are joining to listen to it, and John, the fact that you were able to help me tell this story and bring it out there, it's wonderful. I appreciate it. And the authors that are writing about it and covering wilderness and Spotsylvania, like that attention is needed. Petersburg is needed. Cold Harbor is needed. North End is needed. When you test humanity, you want to go see where that humanity was tested and overcome a lot of stuff. That's where I think we should all allude to, is Overland campaign. Anyways, enough about the poetic shit about it. I do really care about it. It's going to be awesome. We're going to learn a lot about it, and I'm very excited to continue forward with the Overland campaign. Next week, again, or not even big, it could be soon as just like small touch-ups on the Brock Road. I don't know. I'm playing this by ear, as we go along with this show. On that note, if you guys have joined today, thank you so much for being able to spend some time with us. We do look forward to seeing you back. I'll put an announcement up when we have an idea for Spotsylvania. Until next time, you guys have a wonderful rest of your week. See you later.